There is somewhat of a personal experience when looking at the self-portrait of an artist, not only because it allows the viewer to put a face to the masterpieces that the artist has created, but it also offers a glimpse into how the artist represents themselves, or more specifically, it allows the viewer to witness how the artist sees themselves. It's a very intimate and self-exploring experience for the artist to muster up the willpower to illustrate their own face, to stare for long periods at every little detail of themselves, studying every feature, every blemish, every wrinkle, every freckle, every scar. It can even help the creator to find better self-confidence into how to tackle their insecurities, or better comprehend how they felt when sketching or painting themselves in a certain theme or scenario, which is why they also, in a lot of special cases, can offer us lessons and stories that can prove to be invaluable as time passes. But in a world as limitless as the art world, boundaries are constantly being pushed, and the more they are, the more I get nosy, which is probably how I eventually became familiar with the American artist named Bryan Lewis Saunders, a man who not only creates many fascinating self-portraits, but has in fact, till the day of me uploading this very video, made at least one self-portrait every single day since March 30th, 1995. As a result, Bryan's increasing collection of self-portraits consists of over 13,000 individual sketches, paintings, and drawings of him, portrayed in various themes and moods, basically serving as an artist's journal or diary, capturing very specific chapters in his life, inspired by some of his happiest and some of his darkest experiences. The more I looked into Bryan's story, the more I discovered just how much he endures to create his art. From him illustrating every headache he's had for over 20 years, to brief periods of creating self-portraits under the influence of countless types of drugs and intoxicants. As Bryan himself perfectly summarizes, like fingerprints, snowflakes, and DNA, they are all different. No two daily self-portraits are the same. I put the world around me into representations of myself, as I find this more true to my central nervous system, and how we all process and perceive experiences. I am more concerned with channeling experiences than I am collecting memories, but I do both, and much more. And on that note, a warm welcome to all of you to another video. Today, I'm excited to explore with you the multi-faces of Bryan Lewis Saunders. Bryan Lewis Saunders was born in 1969 in Washington, D.C., USA. Once describing his childhood as, quote, colourful, for the majority of his earliest years, he would live with his single mother and occasionally in the summer with his grandparents. According to Bryan, he first picked up a pencil and drew a circle at age 1, only for a week or two to pass when he would start drawing eyes in them. By the time he would first start attending school, he was already excelling as a young student, being put forward for many gifted and talented programs. This would all begin to change as he would continue to age, however, as he was finding himself less and less interested in school as his home life became a little more complicated. Very often he would be home alone after coming home from school, having to carry a house key around his neck on a red lanyard that Bryan would say would be incessantly itchy and uncomfortable from wearing it all day. At rare times when he would lose the key to his house, he would have no choice but to break in, learning from his mother how to break in with a knife through the kitchen window if ever necessary. By age 10, Bryan's life outside of school was starting to become far more hectic. He would begin getting in trouble with the police, as while other kids in his neighborhood were called home by their parents, Bryan would continue to stay late out on the streets whilst his mother would still be at work, sometimes arriving home late drunk. Up until this time, Bryan was hanging out in a nearby sewer where he would play, sometimes skipping school altogether to play there and build forts. However, this curious behaviour of residing himself in unlikely places would apparently develop a step further, when he would begin to break into nearby houses of owners who had recently passed away, sometimes for weeks at a time while still attending school, returning to his family house when his mum finished work. Fear of the unpredictable streets, run-ins with the law, and being out in the dark would not seem to bother the young Bryan in the slightest. But that definitely wasn't the case for him and his family home life, as he would recount ominous memories of being haunted by what he would describe as the bad people. To this day, the bad people have been an elusive presence and somewhat of a grim significance to him. In the link I've left in the video description, there is a spoken word track of Bryan detailing his vivid memories of the bad people. Unfortunately, I'm unable to play a sample due to the track having backing music that's copyrighted, but I'll highlight one of his opening sentences to help better explain who these bad people were exactly. It's a very compelling track, and I highly recommend you have a listen to hear his full interpretation of this particular childhood memory. Quote, "The bad people. I can still see their faces. If they weren't waiting in the bathtub and the shower to stab me, they were one step ahead or behind me, walking from room to room until I got upstairs to my room. I never tried to catch them though. I just wanted them to know that I knew they were there, and that they were there somewhere between me, my bed, and the stairs. So I'd leave the lights on for them, and sometimes my dinner too. My mother hated that, but she was never there." Bryan's fear of these murderous and mysterious bad people would escalate after overhearing a televised 911 call of a woman named Olga, who was murdered by her husband, who was also an escaped convict, in her own home near where Bryan lived. He vividly remembers hearing the murderer's voice in the 911 call, spitting out the name Olga repeatedly as he stabbed her. Traumatized by this event and the sounds of a woman's dying screams, his insidious, unwelcome fears of these bad people, who in Bryan's eyes were killers constantly on the hunt for their next victim, would haunt him for a good majority of his youth, pushing him to regularly practice pretending to be dead before going to sleep, a ritualistic behaviour that Bryan again would explain in gripping detail in his spoken word track. As he would continue to stay out late on the streets, the older high school kids would begin to notice and start bullying him and trying to beat him up. This would spark a more rebellious and at times even violent side to Bryan during his youth. Very rarely ever having more than one friend at a time, being practically inseparable one day and at each other's throats the next. After one fight too many, by the time he was 13, kids were starting to be told by their parents to stay away from him. As the years went on during his youth and adolescence, Bryan's close and personal experiences with violence and even abuse would only go from bad to worse. When Bryan was in elementary school, his mother would eventually send young Bryan to summer camp, in hopes that she could clean up his room and throw all of his toys away, with Bryan being none the wiser. This would be far from a normal camping experience, however, as Bryan would begin to witness dozens of children being abused by their own counsellors. In a place far away from home and his family, he would be subjected to seeing dozens of children in the Onondaga Lodge being molested very methodically every single night. Bryan himself just barely escaped the abuse after being rescued by his grandmother on the day it was said to be his turn. Sadly, his frequent run-ins with law enforcement would eventually lead him to being molested by a police officer in the Juvenile Crime Division in Herndon, Virginia, Fairfax County. Quote, "When he died, they said he always had a way with troubled kids. Yeah, he molested them, and then they wouldn't want to ever have to run into him again, so a lot of them stopped getting in trouble." A couple of years later, by the time Bryan was 15, he shot a girl in the right leg at a bus stop. As a result, he was arrested and avoided being sent to juvenile detention by instead going to military school, where Bryan suffered incredible abuse and torture there. He and his roommates were sometimes locked in a closet for days, with water thrown on them repeatedly with no way to dry off, and occasionally deprived of food. They were beaten by the higher-ranking cadets and ran away multiple times, only to be returned to the school by the police. Bryan would eventually steal an M16 assault rifle, and he barricaded himself in his dorm room. After that, much to Bryan's relief, he was not invited to attend the following year. But Bryan's teenage years were far from untroubled either. His encounters with the police were beginning to become far more serious, as Bryan's behaviour became more extreme. In his late teens, Bryan would admit he tried a hand at grave robbing, not to actually steal grave items or remove dead bodies, but because Bryan instead wanted to see close up, at first hand, what he believed he would soon become, genuinely believing he would not live beyond the age of 18. By age 21, only a few days after his 21st birthday in 1990, Bryan would subsequently experience prison for the first time after yet more run-ins with the law. As if the aforementioned bad people, constantly on the prowl to stab their victims, had somehow possessed the still young Bryan, he was arrested for stabbing someone in DC. Although the victim survived and refused to testify, as well as a lack of evidence, Bryan would nevertheless be indicted on a number of charges, including 2 separate counts of armed robbery and assault with intent to commit robbery while armed. Those 3 felonies alone carried a prison term of up to 15 to 45 years. With this said, Bryan was potentially looking at a maximum of 45 to 135 years in prison. However, according to Bryan, because he was white and he kept refusing the plea deals, he ended up pleading guilty at the very last second to a couple of much lesser crimes and got 2 years time served and was released after serving only 8 months. Quote, "It helped that I had hid the knife and the victim refused to testify. If I had been black, I would likely still be incarcerated." On top of this, Bryan would also have to get his GED or high school equivalency as part of his sentence as well. Whilst in prison, he began ranting and losing his mind on purpose in healthy, constructive ways, which would later be nurtured into Bryan's spoken words and stage performances, which I promise we'll get more into later. Within the confines of prison, he would now begin to face up to his inner demons, instead of continuing to feel the need to lash out at others and create such serious violence, whether to others or himself. Still struggling with his mental well-being, he would periodically be admitted to state mental hospitals, which too, as Bryan explains, would sadly contain many kinds of abuse as well. Bryan also relates that following this period, he would live in a chicken coop for 2 weeks, with an uncle who would later commit suicide, as well as a homeless shelter and eventually a rented room in a biker house, also a den for where his roommates were making crystal meth, festering with, quote, "real monsters," in an extremely violent living situation. As if his life appeared to be an endless cycle of the darkest sides of humanity, by 1993, something would finally, ever so slightly, adjust the course of his future to a more positive direction. That year of 1993, Bryan would turn 24 and start attending East Tennessee State University to study art. He lived on campus in the dorms all year round, for 5 years straight, because by then, he had become completely institutionalized. As bleak as this may sound, through his art development he was given exciting opportunities to travel to Turkey, Greece, and many other Western European countries. Bryan believes travel in itself played a crucial role in his development away from violence as well. And when he started having art exhibits and experimenting with spoken word performances, it encouraged him to further stay away from a dark life of crime and death. In fact, in what Bryan would describe as an exorcism of his childhood fears and trauma, he would find relief in exploring such concepts within drawings and painting. He was now discovering new and countless ways of unloading his inner monologue through either a pencil or a paintbrush. After many years of keeping a secret life away from his mother and being told to just suck it up, art seemed to be the perfect answer to releasing all of his suppressed feelings and experiences. Perhaps this perfect storm of a more positive surrounding and a chance to physicalize his thoughts and experiences would be what would kickstart Bryan's ambitious project. He began drawing himself every day since the fateful day of March 30th, 1995. A project that, at the time of me uploading this video, would remain ongoing and unwavering for 27 years. By the time Bryan graduated from university, Bryan's fascination and exploring inwardly would begin to take on a life of its own, from learning new art techniques, meeting like-minded artists, and having access to high-end art supplies. Bryan was now truly fine-tuning his unique style, especially now with his growing collection of daily self-portraits, with him illustrating himself within the school walls, capturing a glimpse into his daily life as an art student. Some paintings and drawings of his capture an almost cold-like atmosphere within a university, or at least from Bryan's perspective at times. The walls are pale white and near featureless, like hospital walls, or even, as Bryan described, almost like a prison. In this particular self-portrait of him up against a background of a frosted, concrete-framed window, Bryan would describe how to him these windows always seem to remind him of prison bars, a self-constructed concrete cage that has been built piece by piece, directly from Bryan's brain. Although his art was improving, and although he seemingly found a haven to nurture his talents, unfortunately the same could not be said about his grades. Bryan would admit that he would struggle to keep up with the necessary assignments and the often overly specific instructions given by his teachers. The idea of trying to create art with such a narrow wide space of rules and requirements simply did not match Bryan's ideas of how and what he wanted to express, even inadvertently attracting unwanted attention after a photography student took pictures of Bryan sewing his mouth shut. As a result, the administration, called the ACLU, came to the school to talk to them both because they were afraid they were going to be sued. But the ACLU would ultimately be on Bryan's side during the process. On top of this, no real willingness arose from the school to help improve his grades or assignments, causing him to go through noticeable periods of sheer anxiety in his self-portraits around this time, portraying his face buried under chaotic, jagged, torn and splintered splashes of colour, truly emanating the mental disarray of a panic attack. In other words, Bryan felt no desire whatsoever to create paintings with such specific rules in place, or paint something that did not relate to him personally. To name one example, Bryan would be asked to create a drawing that had to weigh 5 pounds, instantly eliminating any motivation for him to focus on such a task, depriving him of room for creativity and purpose. But as he approached his graduation in 1998, still fresh after his proclaimed purpose was found in the end within himself and his self-portraits, and already well and truly in the midst of a lifelong project, he would soon be free from such restrictions. And his goal to study and capture himself at any given moment of every given day was now about to stretch in ways that even himself had not predicted. In May of 1998, not long after graduating, and with a newly awarded degree in drawing, Bryan, feeling optimistic for his future, moved into a tiny office space downtown. It was supposed to be used as an art studio, and not intended for anyone to actually live there, but some of the other art students did anyway. Bryan explains that his office apartment was only slightly longer than a prison cell, and the building had no kitchen or showers, but for only $65 a month, Bryan thought it was worth not having some of the creature comforts of a regular living space. In the office, he lived with different coloured lighting, and at times he noticed it seemed to have powerful psychological impacts on him. Continuing his goal on self-exploration and means to cope with his mental health, Bryan began making lists of everything he could think of in order to organise them in an attempt to make some kind of meaning out of his life. He made a public confession where he listed all of the people he had ever hurt. He wrote down every single word he knew in English, and he made a list of everything he owned. In turn, he began recording and writing down all of his dreams and carefully categorising all of his experiences. As a result, Bryan, although already no stranger to outlandish ideas for art, began to see a new approach to his self-portraits by experimenting with different colours of light. On October 5th, 1998, Bryan would purchase 6 yellow floodlights. The following day, he began what he would later recall as the Yellow Month, where he lived and worked under the influence of a very intense yellow light 24 hours a day, spending hour after hour working on each self-portrait. During the experiment, he remembered thinking about Picasso's pink and blue periods and decided to do the primary pigment colours instead. So immediately, upon the conclusion of Yellow Month, he would purchase red and blue floodlights next, and then did both of these colours immediately afterwards. The only writings that Bryan composed from the yellow experiment came from day 7. Quote, "My Yellow Month and the self-portraits are revealing things beyond my words. I can sleep good tonight, and I look forward to tomorrow. Art has done that for me. It is a rare feeling. I don't quite know what is occurring, perhaps a subtle revelation of my growing technical skills. I'm enthusiastic. Perhaps it is the yellow light in my room constantly shining for the last 6 days. If so, what will the red and blue months reveal in me? I can only imagine. God bless you all, my self-portraits. I have stopped drinking beer. College was extremely hard on me mentally and physically. The only ways in which I was challenged was in the authoritarian institutional aspect of it, in which I still have deep concern, borderline anger towards it. Things are really looking up for me in life. I'm not here to record this day and age. I'm only here to record how I felt about certain things. Yellow light is not causing patience, focused attention. It is a use of control over my environment that has leaked over into the art. Art is my hook in the ground. You may ask, why should you care about me? And I may answer, why should you care about yourself? To me, life is a collection of conscious experiences. By listing these experiences and imposing order upon them, they become packaged in such a way that I can collect them. The more I experience, the more data I accumulate, the more the urge to collect the experience, the more zest I have for life, and the more I want to guide and create my experiences." End quote. What I find really interesting about the Yellow Month in particular is despite being immersed in nothing but a consistent yellow glow, and despite plenty of examples of Bryan resonating shades of yellow in his self-portraits, he is still able to experiment effectively with other colours as well. You can almost sense an excitement in Bryan discovering how colours are reacting differently in yellow light, almost feeling like he's discovering different colours for the first time in his life. But I also find it interesting how even through a generally positive period for Bryan, he is still able to create quite dark and haunting imagery. Day 7 in particular feels powerfully untamed, like he's regurgitating a monster within him. In day 25, Bryan is cast in dark shadow, with what appears to be a blood-stained mouth snarling at the viewer. It would seem in Bryan's head during this experiment, his positive energy and confidence was not just in creating positive imagery, but also in emptying his darkest thoughts, so freely and creatively as well. The next colour Bryan would choose to commit himself to would be red, which this time would materialise a far less positive effect on his mental health. Immediately, the process became a 24-hour-a-day battle for Bryan to either, quote, hold on to my sanity or fight to recapture it again. From the self-portraits we're presented with during this month of the colour red, there is an irrefutable wide spectrum of the lowest to the very highest emotions, with signs of Bryan practically fluctuating in and out of a sound mind. Bryan would recount feeling himself quickly becoming increasingly aggressive and hostile inside, finding himself looking in the mirror with fear of turning into an uncontrollable savage animal right in front of his very eyes. He would struggle in the intense glow of a red room to distinguish colours from one another. White paint in particular would now be a permanent shade of pink. And on one occasion, Bryan would get an illusion of his flesh appearing reflective and metallic, to the point that Bryan genuinely became concerned that he may have been causing permanent damage to his eyes. Quote, Everything either went away or got replaced by something else the next day, so I just kept going." End quote. The final month of Bryan's Colour Month series would be dedicated to blue, a month that Bryan looks back on as being, quote, "the worst of all the colour months." Due to overexposure to the intense blue light, Bryan would recall a definite overproduction of melatonin that gave him incredible fatigue throughout the month. He would also feel incredibly depressed, or as Bryan would describe it, quote, "I felt like a sad and lonely little elf. At times I would force myself to smile and begin repeating a happy phrase in order to not get locked into the depths of a crushing depression." As his sleeping pattern began to deteriorate, his depression would only worsen. Within 2 weeks, he would become completely uninspired and uncreative, as well as constantly fighting to remain focused. As Bryan would look back upon this experiment as the years passed, he couldn't help but wonder if the seasons of the year would have played any significance. For example, had he conducted the blue month during the summer instead, would there have been as big of a difference? Would the blue lights have been as debilitating? Many moons later, during the COVID-19 quarantine of 2020, Bryan would return to this experiment once again, in his house with different pigments of colour, such as pink and green. The green month of June to July 2020 was in Bryan's mind sort of testing his hypothesis. As you can see from a few of the examples, it was more or less the same mental effect that the colour blue had on him many years before in that office building he once lived in. Although Blue Month would have been one of his most difficult challenges in all the colour months, I have to say some of the imagery that has emerged from it is incredibly thought-provoking and beautifully surreal. And with this month having the most duplicate self-portraits produced in a single day out of the other 2 months, it's clear that Bryan desperately wanted to unload his turmoil whenever possible. I find myself drawn to his day 3 piece the most. For whatever reason, I find it simply terrifying. A face devoid of key features, left with only a slit for a mouth and basic, tiny beady black eyes staring completely emotionlessly towards the viewer, is the kind of imagery that awakens a threat within me. Like I'm looking at an imitation of humanity and emotion, with no real way to safely relate to it. For Bryan to see himself in this way, as the days would only continue to drag on, must have been really horrific to endure. Although still remaining true to his daily schedule of creating at least one self-portrait, he would not conduct another test of endurance until September 2000, in which Bryan decided, to put it simply, not talk or communicate for an entire month, a scenario that Bryan would naturally find incredibly challenging, being a very social person who enjoys talking to people and telling stories. Incidentally, Bryan would find himself creating more than one self-portrait a day within that 30-day period. But as you can see from some of these examples, the effects that such silence can play on a person deprived of the ability to socialize or talk to anyone, especially on such an extroverted personality, can often spark a vast array of feelings and thoughts. A lot of the imagery in Bryan's Vow of Silence series resembles that of isolation, alienation, and almost agoraphobic sensations, like being lost in a plateau or on a desert island. I have left a link in the video description below should you wish to see the entire collection from this experiment. In the same year, Bryan would move to a historic hotel named the John Saviour Hotel, which had been renovated into public housing. The building would comprise of 11 floors, which Bryan would in no time discover were inhabited by some of the most interesting characters he had met in Johnson City, Tennessee. During the early days of his tenancy, Bryan had a somewhat grandiose idea of making a documentary dedicated to the fascinating residents and interviewing them. However, to his disappointment, Bryan found that the vast majority were extremely reclusive and practically shut-ins for the majority of the time. There would also be an extremely tragic circumstance that would also put this idea on hold. Bryan found out after moving in that a good friend of his from art school, Jennifer Renfro, was soon to be moving to a new place of herself close by. She too had a romantic idea of renovating an old, disused church into a house that she could live in. However, the night before Thanksgiving, while she was replacing hardwood floors, loose embers from a wood stove would ignite the flooring materials that she was using, subsequently setting the entire property ablaze and sadly taking Jennifer's life with it. Bryan was absolutely devastated. Just a day after her funeral, Bryan would learn that another close art school friend, Don Morgan, had shot himself in the head with a Russian .32 pistol. He would miraculously survive, but sadly would still suffer from partial paralysis, severe brain damage, and permanent confusion from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to his temple. Whilst his friend was recovering in hospital, things would go from bad to worse. For the third time in his life, Bryan's right lung collapsed. He would be rushed to hospital, where surgeons would have to perform a lobectomy, removing the top half of his lung to prevent more collapses. A touch of relief would bless Bryan shortly afterwards, however, when his friend, Brandon Bragg, was in the midst of travelling from Georgia to Maine on a hiking trail in the eastern United States, the Appalachian Trail. During the time when Bryan was being discharged from hospital, Brandon would invite him along for a couple of days. Together they would walk approximately 600 miles in 2 months, with Bryan carrying about 5 pounds of art supplies. This small selection of nature-inspired art documents his first and only long-term experience with nature. While Bryan would recount the recent tragedies to Brandon attempted to inspire Bryan of the wonders of nature and convinced him to continue the journey with him to Maine. At this time, Bryan had never once hiked a single day, and now with only 1.5 lungs, as Bryan puts it, he decided to put his life in his friend's hands. The experience in the end, however, would be looked back upon fondly by Bryan. Every new day he would witness and draw really interesting and new things he would come across in the wilderness. And he can really sense a calmness and tranquility in his illustrations during this time. And needless to say, the trip allowed Bryan to heal not just from his collapsed lung, but from his heavy mind as well. Much like many other curious souls who stumbled across the works of Bryan Lewis Saunders, how I first discovered him was through the series of self-portraits that we're about to discuss. Arguably one of his most popular, or at least one of his most well-known periods in his ongoing self-portrait series. During the midst of the Appalachian Trail, Brandon would ask Bryan, quote, "Whatever happened to that movie you were going to make about all those people in your building?" To which Bryan answered, believing most of the people appeared like they were either on drugs or suffering in isolation, or both. One time a social worker would inform Bryan that for many of the residents, quote, if they could get out of their recliners 3 times a day, it was a good day. Bryan would then tell Brandon that he was becoming aware of one resident named Dwayne who was paralysed from a car accident and possessed a massive book in his apartment, which turned out to be an encyclopedia of pills. To which Dwayne said, I could find at least one of every kind of pill in that book somewhere in our building. By the time Brandon and Bryan hiked to New York, Bryan had unknowingly become extremely dehydrated and was hallucinating and paranoid. He would discontinue travelling with Brandon at a monastery, genuinely believing that Brandon was trying to poison him. Bryan would jump on the first Greyhound bus back to Tennessee, after being back for a few days and having a hard time adjusting to not walking and being in the woods all day and night. Bryan would take a couple of pills, and he would draw the final daily self-portrait in his Appalachian Trail sketchbook. However, the pills quickly changed his feelings as he was working on the drawing. As a result, Bryan was astounded at how well he captured the change. Although there had been instances of Bryan drawing himself under the influence before, this newfound concept now inspiring him, and with a fresh new sketchbook ready for his next project, Bryan decided this time he would try a different drug every day for 12 days straight and note the changes. Bryan was so excited with the idea that he would admit he went somewhat overboard, taking as much as 19 drugs in the 12-day period, resulting in terrible side effects, which once again, Bryan would recount in extremely shocking detail. Bryan would detail his first official self-portrait in his Narcotics series by also detailing the previous experience that inspired him with the idea. Quote, earlier in the day, I'd drawn myself on both Valium and Xanax and found that picture to be quite striking. Almost immediately, I could imagine an incredibly interesting future ahead of me as I discovered a ton of diverse artistic possibilities. I remember standing there in front of the huge dormitory bathroom mirror, with the window behind me and my shirt off, feeling alive and strong. The window in my apartment went from the floor to the ceiling, with only one divider in the center. But I divided it into 3 sections, turning it into a parallel circuit so I could trap and harness the energy that I was feeling all around me. I was so excited and totally determined. I had a megaton of energy. The walls in my apartment were white, and the light in my apartment was a soft white, but I made it look yellow for electricity, and the green around it was to ground it. Bryan believes at the time of drawing his second self-portrait that he must have realised taking more than one drug in a day was a bit excessive, to say the least. So on day 2 of the experiment, he decided to take Valium again, but Valium only, not taking it with anything else or doing any other drugs later that day. Quote, doing multiple drugs at once or taking more than one drug in a single day probably didn't seem like a good experimental control. I remember telling myself in the beginning that I was only going to do one drug at a time, but that didn't last very long. This time I took twice as much Valium as before, so I could really feel the effects of it, and I spent more time on the drawing. I paid a lot of attention to how I was feeling. The increase in dosage seemed to really exacerbate the fuzziness I felt too. I was still overflowing with energy and excitement, but the drug kept me pretty calm. It took the edge off somewhat. I was more focused than I was the day before, but at the same time I was more loose with my gestures. I had an overall sense of happiness, comfort, and well-being. On day 3, due to prior engagements, Bryan would be out of town on this particular day, meaning he had no access to drugs at this time. Audra, the friend that he was visiting, was also a bartender, to which Bryan said, quote, well, alcohol's a drug, isn't it? so I sat at the bar with my sketchbook and a bag of coloured pencils and began drawing my reflection in the mirror behind the bar. I drank 11 mixed drinks in all. I started off seeing myself in a very level-headed, sober way, but within only a couple of hours, I could barely hold my head up and I couldn't walk straight. I needed a map showing me how to get back to where I was staying, but then once I left the bar, I could only make it to the parking lot where Audra's truck was parked. I passed out in the bed of her pickup until she finished her shift. On the upper right side of the page is a list of all the liquor drinks I drank. The burgundy and yellow scribbles over my head and behind me were conversations or voices of people standing around me as the bar was starting to get crowded. I've never shown this image before because I don't find it to be very representative of the effects of alcohol on the drawing. I'm including this image in the series though, as it's an important piece of a story, as it was the only intoxicant I did on day 3, but it appears as if I was almost done drawing myself before the alcohol had even taken effect. I'm pretty certain I drew myself first and then the bar. Then I drew the background sounds and then the map. I know I finished the drawing with the X while laying down in the back of a truck just before passing out. The results of day 4 would be a result of Percocet combined with a horrific hangover. Quote, I felt hot and my skin felt oily. That's why I chose these metallic crayons. I also felt a bit ornery. Instead of having a perma-grin grimace like you do when you're high sometimes, I had a perma-furrowed brow. Other than that, there were not many other noticeable changes. You can see why I tell people that this experiment was art and not science, because experiences from one day can heavily influence and directly affect our perceptions during the following day. It is totally impossible to start each day fresh with a clean slate. How much of my effect was due to the prior alcohol use and not the Percocet? Probably a lot. Day 5 would be quite a unique case in this particular chapter of his self-portrait series, when Bryan would next consume 10 milligrams of Loratab. Not really having much noticeable physical effects on him, except for an excessively itchy nose. Bryan explains the following. I thought it was kind of silly drawing myself while rubbing my nose constantly. It may be that I did not perceive any other of the physical changes because my attention stayed hyper-focused on the side effect once I recognized it. It is difficult to say. Humans are incredibly bad at correctly determining the causes and effects of things. That's what science is for. For day 6, this would in fact be Bryan's second experience of drawing himself on nitrous oxide. He had different motivation the first time he tried it, so this time he decided to take more care to draw only whilst feeling the effects. Bryan would describe the experience as follows. Each time I inhaled, I tried to capture a different aspect of the experience or something new that my attention had shifted to. I formed my ears out of a wah 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 sound instead of using abstract lines in the background to delineate it. For the lightness or vacancy I felt in my forehead, I used very light pencil marks as I was feeling them. I captured my head twisting nicely in response to the dizziness. I shaded my bottom jaw more broadly and softly to go along with the heaviness of my head as I felt myself returning to a more solid physical presence. I used the dark line of my glasses temple to show the pressure in the temple of my skull. On this occasion with nitrous oxide, I felt really tuned in to the synchronicity between feeling and drawing. Later that day, Bryan would obtain Xanax, and the resulting drawing became, quote, one of my most favourite drug drawings ever since. Bryan would continue on to say, I didn't consciously select an earth, clay and dirt colour palette. I only drew what I felt and saw, but my intuitive use of colour was really spot on, because the Xanax grounded me and brought me down to earth, and even made me feel like it was okay to be introverted. It gave me a superb sense of inner peace. I still had lots of energy, but it wasn't a nervous energy. I felt light on my feet. I walked to the store and I was floating. The experiences felt very similar to having a Turkish bath. Xanax seemed to prevent the energy from becoming a negative angst or anxiety. Physically, I got pretty warm, but it was a comfortable warmth. My increasing temperature didn't concern me or alarm me at all. Like I said, I felt really great inside my own body and brain. It was a wonderful experience. One week into the experiment, Bryan at this stage was becoming impressed with the results of his self-portraits over the last few days. Bryan recounted this experience as follows. It was so inspiring. I was so thrilled to see how my drawings were turning out based on the different drug effects and what I was paying attention to while being on them, and that the experiment had become truly exhilarating. To see myself under different conditions and representing myself naturally with different styles and marking systems, it was absolutely incredible to me. My friend's co-worker Red heard about my experiment and cleaned out her medicine cabinet for me. I remember thinking that was so cool of her to give me these 3 drugs, and I was so excited to see what the next drawing would look like that I took all of them at once without even thinking about it. I used so many different art supplies because I took those 3 drugs at once, and I was like, heck with it. If I'm doing everything, then I'm using everything. As you can see from the angle and expression on my face, that by the time I started drawing, I was barely hanging in there. My ears got really hot. I mean, they were burning. I got an intense, glowing marijuana-like high and another big increase in energy. I could see colours more intensely too. But I also had this overwhelming sensation. At any second I would burst open or fall apart or totally lose it somehow. I just felt like I was constantly on the verge of erupting or rupturing or something. I was using drawing to keep hanging on and having so much fun. I was really happy. On day 8 of the experiment, Bryan would obtain magic mushrooms from visiting a friend, with him carrying 2 large mushroom caps dipped in chocolate. Quote, I ate them and knew it would take a little while for them to kick in, and so I started setting up all my art supplies in front of a giant mirror and slowly but kind of sloppily began sketching the outlines of my face and light pencil. At the first signs of the mushrooms taking effect, I switched to coloured pencil to more clearly outline my features. My focus started gradually getting sucked into my reflection, and by the time I was starting to peak, my face was only a few inches away. By now my eyes had become enlarged and I could see details in them with tons of clarity. I started doing the highlights and reflected lights next. I knew at the time that the colour choices seemed weird, but they were matching up exactly to what I was experiencing. I really got in the flow drawing my facial hair. The next thing I know, my eyes behind my glasses leaped onto a separate plane from the rest of my face, and the light was getting blindingly bright around them. As soon as I started seeing pixels radiating from the centre of my face, I knew that I only had a little time left to be able to accurately see what I was drawing. I quickly darkened the sides of my head and beard and filled in my shoulders and one of my ears. By now the pixels were streaming like full automatic tracer fire at night, and it was all I could do to try and capture their directional pattern. The drawing is unfinished because I stopped once it became too challenging to stay focused on anything. Without a doubt in Bryan's mind, as well as being my personal favourite drawing of the series, the most challenging and mentally crippling experience he endured during this intense period of intoxicants would be when he would take 100 milligrams of Seroquel. a prescribed heavy tranquilizer or antipsychotic agent on day 9. Once again, Bryan explains in great detail just how awful this particular experience was for him, as follows. I went to my psychiatrist to try and get more drugs and told him about my experiment and showed him all of my pictures on different stuff. But he only wrote one prescription for me, and it was for 90 Seroquel pills. I assumed he thought I was psychotic for taking such an undertaking, but I'd never had Seroquel before, so I was thankful for the help. The experience was god-awful though, I mean totally dreadful. Like normal, I took it and sat in front of my large mirror, waiting for some kind of physical changes to occur. I slowly started drawing my outline and trying to get the proportions just right and drawing myself with very faint lines, none of which are still visible in the picture anymore. All of a sudden, this incredibly bad feeling washed over me. It instantly erased my pleasant mood. Right then I looked in the mirror and a voice inside my head, not my inner voice, it was a stranger's voice, said, "Don't look in the mirror," very forcibly. It shook me. So I thought, oh shit, okay, I just need to keep drawing. So I looked down at the page, at the drawing I was doing, and then the same voice said to me, "Don't look at your book," very forcibly again, and I was like, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit. I may have to lay down for a minute. And when I turned my head to look at the bed, that forceful voice came back and said, "Don't look at your bed." And right then I was stuck. I was stuck in hell. My mind was still going, but my body had been detached from it. It was awful. I had to fight it with every bit of strength I had to keep making hard marks or I would freeze up. I just had to keep the pencil moving. I tried to smile it away and give myself happy thoughts, with no luck. At some point I realised what a tranquilizer really was. I always saw the lion on TV with a hurt foot getting shot with a tranquilizer dart and assumed the lion was drunk and in some la-la land, but I was wrong. It was then that I realised that the lion actually wants to maul those people and chew their throats and drag them off into the bush and feed his family with those folks. But he just can't move, he's stuck. The body is detached from his brain, and that shook me hard. I will never forget that experience. It was a real epiphany. The ominously dark shading and cracks in his head give off such a powerful sensation, as if his head is literally coming apart. It truly is gripping and terrifying to look at. Following a horrific and draining experience with Seroquel, Bryan would take his next drug, 10 milligrams of Ambien, in the evening time of that very same day. Quote, "I took it in the evening, long after I could move again. One of the first things that I noticed was that colours were slowly being heightened, as if there was a hidden saturation knob behind my eyes that was ever so slowly being turned up. My ears got really warm. I felt that I could see more clearly and more intensely, but when I tried to focus intensely, in reality, my vision was moderately blurry. I was also a little bit bored because the changes were not as drastic as I had hoped. As I grew tired, my arm that was holding my head up seemed to detach from my body on the page as I got closer to the floor. The Seroquel may have had a part in that. I found the colours interesting the next day when I woke up, because they look similar to the colour palettes people with insomnia tend to use. Blue facial hair, lavender shadows, and red-orange skin, clashing background. Did a drug for sleeping make me look like I couldn't sleep? For day 10, Bryan walked around downtown with his sketchbook and quote, Robo tripping pretty hard. He continued to say, "The sequence of these events might not be right because the experience was pretty intense. I found a Korean textbook in the gutter. I drew myself with a red pen while listening to something. I shaded myself in with more cough syrup. I glued a picture out of a book onto the page and then walked to the magic wok because I knew the hostess was Korean. I went inside and asked her what the picture said, and she wrote on it in Korean instead. And when I asked her what she wrote, I think she said, "Very beautiful woman." So I wrote that in English underneath it. 3 days later, Audra came over to check on me when I wouldn't let her in while I was on PCP. She saw this picture and freaked out. Look at you, you're giving yourself Down syndrome." And I was having difficulty moving and talking, and that was when I stopped the experiment. I could see exactly what she meant by this picture. Later, after the effects of taking Robitussin cough syrup had eased off, Bryan had developed a bit of anxiety and fatigue. And so he would crush up a Buse bar and he snorted it. Quote, "It had been prescribed for me in the past as an anti-anxiety agent, and it worked pretty well for that, but didn't ever seem to work quite fast enough. The effects of snorting it hit me in waves. I would get a sudden rush of wooziness, like a flood of super calmness that would sweep over me. It wasn't too worrisome. I just figured it was my body trying to keep up with how fast the Buse bar was acting. When it would happen, it would demand my attention, so I had to draw myself in the moments between those waves and the returning energy that would build up right before the next wave would hit. I had enough time in between the waves to focus and draw 1 or 2 parts of my head or face. Then as the returning energy would begin to swell, I'd stop drawing myself and begin furiously scrawling the background until the next anti-energy wave hit. If you look closely, you can see I started with the farthest space between my head and used the wrong end of a pen to scratch the rising energy into the paper behind me. There were several of these energy layers that went through me and around me, and each successive one seemed to decrease in strength, and I made them coming outward or forward on the page until the final one was totally outside of me in the front space, a soft light layer of hot red. Then I added a little white paint under my nose at the end. It was a strange experience to be drawing in between some sweeping physiological changes like this, and I'm not sure if I've ever experienced that again since. By the time day 11 approached, word about Bryan's extreme experiment was beginning to circulate amongst the residents of the building. Quote, "People had been giving me drugs and coming over and seeing my drawings and telling other people about it, and around noon there was a knock on my door. As soon as I opened it, an elderly alcoholic-looking man that I didn't know stuck his arm straight out at me and said, 'When I was a kid we used to huff lighter fluid.' He was holding a brown paper bag, like the kind you get from a liquor store, and inside it was a sock, soaked in lighter fluid. He said, 'Here,' and as soon as I took it, he walked away. I took one whiff and saw fumes, and I was like, whoa, metallic crayons would be perfect for this. I sat in front of a mirror, breathing short breaths out of a paper bag, with one hand and drawing with crayons in the other. I love how perfect the metallic crayons translated the experience. You can see the fumes in my glassy eyes. The waves behind my head are fumes too, but are also representative of that wah 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 sensation I get from inhalants. You can even see my vision blurring out when I started drawing the bag around my mouth as I was holding it there longer and longer to draw it. It was pretty nuts. Later that evening, Bryan decided to snort Ritalin with his friend Russell. Quote, "The image reminds me of the butabital pills from day 1 quite a bit, only I was calmer and much more focused. Surprisingly, it does not look anything like the Adderall image. Both of those medicines are stimulants and used to treat similar symptoms, but the effects on me were totally different. I didn't snort the Adderall though, and are both made out of different active ingredients. I drew this image while looking in the mirror, and even though my marks were very high energy, I did spend a bit of time actually looking at my features and the page. I would say I was hyper-focused even, but in an unusual way. I didn't lose myself in the minutiae. I spent much more time on the three-dimensionality of space. I also perceived a sensitivity to light. The lights in my apartment were not anything close to that bright. The next day, Bryan would wake up in the afternoon at lunchtime. Quote, I ate a ham sandwich with tomato in it at the Melting Pot Soup Kitchen across the street from my apartment. Soon after that, I tried PCP. I say that I made the PCP myself, but I didn't have to do much to it. Just dissolve it in water and put it on something else and let it dry and then smoke it. I got it the night before at a local bar from my acquaintance who had heard about the experiment, and he gave it to me in powder form, in a glass vial, along with instructions. After it dissolved in water, it was this yellow apple juice looking stuff. If I'm remembering right, he told me to heat up the water first on the stove, but as I'm thinking about it now, I believe I may be misremembering that and instead just poured some of the liquid onto the stove burners, let it dry, and then turned the stove on and inhaled it that way, without putting it on a cigarette, because that was how I lit my cigarette sometimes when I didn't have a lighter. Thinking back on it now, that makes a bit more sense to me. I remember it scorched my throat. Any drugs that detach your mind from your body I don't care for too much. This was also one of them. I have this vague recollection of being in the kitchen, hovering over the stove. Then people started knocking on my door, asking if they could see my drawings of the Appalachian Trail. So I let them in, and more people came over, and the next thing you know, I had 20 people in my apartment laughing and listening to me telling my stories and showing them my pictures. Then all of a sudden I heard someone whisper, "Bryan, these people aren't real." And I froze. Total panic. Almost as soon as the shock wore off, someone else knocked on my door. I let them in and started showing them my pictures, and more people knocked and came in, and everyone was laughing and listening to my stories and then looking at my pictures, and wham! "Bryan, these people aren't real." And I froze in total panic again. This happened numerous times. The next day, Audra came over because she was really concerned about me doing the drug experiment. She said she kept coming over and knocking on my door to check on me and could hear me inside talking to people, but I never answered the door for her. That was so insane. I remembered to draw myself at one point when I was sitting on the floor in the bathroom vomiting. Each time I heaved, my face shifted off my head in front of me in stages. My nose got really clogged up, and when I blew it, all of this bright red chunky matter came out, and I thought it was my brain. I thought my brain was hemorrhaging and sloughing off and clogging up my nose, but what it was were pieces of that tomato from a sandwich earlier, and I must have gotten a slice from the end with a lot of skin on it. It was awful. The next day is when I stopped the daily drug drawing experiment. On the last official day of his experiment under the influence, Bryan began to notice himself moving slowly and talking and thinking slowly, and even feeling his emotions slowly. A strange condition that Bryan would refer to as, quote, psychomotor retardation. It wasn't scary at all though, he would recall. I felt very peaceful. I spent the next few days recuperating and getting back on my feet, being hospitalized briefly, and then transferred to 2 different group homes. It took me 2 hours to paint those few lines. Even though I was slow, I felt clean, clear, and pure. It was so strange. I don't believe I've ever done another self-portrait with white paint on white paper like that either. Just reaching for things and taking a few steps took longer than my brain expected them to. However, the usual frustration that comes from not being able to grab something quickly or move fast enough was totally missing. There was no inner impatience with my body at all. It was a really bizarre condition that I found myself in. Ironically, I was treated for this with more drugs, and I was tested for this with antipsychotics. As Bryan briefly mentioned, after his Under the Influence series had now concluded, he would experience another episode of living in various hospitals and group homes. This brief period would once again be mostly riddled with health issues and mental instability for Bryan, emphasised by a lot of the self-portraits he created during this time. Although Bryan would voluntarily admit himself to these various institutions, fully aware he needed help, he would still have the peace of mind knowing that he could still have a notebook and a pack of crayons close by his side, allowing him to continue creating, even drawing when at times heavily bedbound and in severe pain. In the following year of 2002, Bryan would leave the institutions and group homes to move with his family in Central Virginia, with his aunt, his great aunt, his first and second cousins, and his grandmother. Bryan was now faced with a new problem in his new abode, however. Living in a trailer with the family, Bryan remembers how the trailer would contain constant arguments and drama, mostly centered around the raising of his second cousin, Taylor Louise, who at the time was a very small child, and sadly being, quote, exposed to a lot of problems in life. Bryan would also mention how his grandmother would suffer from a series of strokes, and how his great aunt was suffering from the late stages of Alzheimer's disease, often struggling to remember anything past 18 seconds. The constant tension of these new surroundings would push Bryan to a sense of adventure and escapism once again, when he decided he would make a trip to China. Bryan had always been fascinated in Chinese culture, though the origin of this interest came primarily from his school years, often looking back on how much outrageous misinformation on China was shared in elementary school, such as a misconception of drowning baby girls, for example. Of course, Bryan would be faced with a language barrier upon arriving in China, and so decided before he would venture to the Asian continent to learn Mandarin. For 6 hours a day, 7 days a week, for approximately 9 months, Bryan would study and practice speaking Mandarin, often visiting a local Chinese restaurant to help him practice. Which is how he would befriend a Chinese waiter who would visit Bryan every once in a while to practice English whilst helping Bryan with Mandarin, though Bryan would admit the former was often more frequent than the latter, with learning Mandarin being more or less completely self-taught. One aspect Bryan would notice whilst learning more about the language and the culture would be how little tourists there were in China, or at least American tourists. He would continue to practice Mandarin with locals, eventually even telling stand-up jokes in Mandarin, which seemingly were well received. The thought then struck Bryan about a potential endeavour that he could pursue, when he had the idea of being a stand-up comedian. The grand idea of making it in stand-up comedy in China, then possibly becoming famous enough for a Chinese sitcom, and then becoming even more famous as a Chinese movie star, would be something irresistible to Bryan to at least attempt. Bryan would begin the first step of his plan by performing a self-written comedy routine at a Chinese wedding in New York. When the event went down well, the possibility of his grand plan leading to success seemed more and more likely to him. His plans would be completely shattered, however, upon arriving in China, when he would encounter a local who spoke English and who had lived in America briefly, would inform the once eager Bryan that no such entertainment existed in China, and no venues in the country would facilitate stand-up comedy. In 2005, Bryan would return to America, depressed, with dreams dashed, and once again living in the John Xavier Hotel. This would be the end of one dream, but a blessing in disguise for the conception of a more unique spin on the role of a stand-up performer. America certainly knows no lack of successful comedians, going by the dozens, if not hundreds, in mainstream media. So Bryan would decide if this was his given path to stay in the States, then he would instead do stand-up tragedy, with the aim to make people cry or despair instead of laugh. After performing these visceral, poetic shows in small local venues, it would eventually lead him to release a vast discography of his intense spoken word storytelling from as early as 2006, such as Inner Demon demos that he released that very year. The stories, more often than not, make it onto the stage of his live performances as well. Possibly one of his most intense performances to date is the one later titled Under the Influence of Torture. This experiment would be conducted with what is known as the Apollo chair, as used by the Savak, Iran's former and most dreaded and feared brutal secret police institution. Perhaps the chair was redesigned by John Duncan and built by Nicolas Minoud specifically for the performance at the Lausanne Underground Film and Music Festival. Bryan, of course, would also provide many self-portraits that document this experiment, some of which are sadly not safe for work for me to show, but I can't help but immediately be magnetized to his drawing called Crushing. I find it hard to put into words exactly why I'm drawn to this one, other than perhaps my personal phobia of somehow being crushed. Maybe I'm slightly claustrophobic, but the way Bryan applies violent swirls of dark colours in the centre of his chest, with a body that appears melting or evaporating away, it really does ignite an unwelcomingly familiar sensation of being crushed. Or how I would wake from sleep paralysis with that heavy, sinking chasm in my chest as I'm fighting to fully awake. It's not so much about technique in these particular drawings, it's about representing how Bryan felt in those terrifying moments. This experiment would consist of close friends, Lisa Moss and Brad Ward, who agreed to torture Bryan every Monday for months leading up to the live torture event in Switzerland with John Duncan. It's important to mention at this point, this was a completely consensual and controlled experiment, conducted only by deeply trusted friends who since the beginning did not want to hurt Bryan, but believed wholeheartedly in his projects, resulting in multiple days of repeating the same tortures to get them to, quote, really torture their friend. I have left a link to his entire discography and performance media in the video description, in case you want to take a closer gander. I definitely recommend it for anyone who really wants to get a feel for Bryan's background and experiences from his own perspective, and of course, in his own words. By 2011, after countless more projects, stage performances, and obviously thousands upon thousands of self-portraits by this stage, Bryan was ready to embark on his next concept of human endurance and conditioning. He had a couple of years earlier finished his sensation self-portrait experiment, which unfortunately, due to the graphic nature of some of the end results, I can only show you a select few from this series, I'm afraid. But Bryan was not the sort of artist to idly stay away from grand ideas, and so it would not be too long that he would conduct another somewhat sensory-themed experiment, this time for 28 days straight, from October 25th to November 21st, 2011. Bryan would conduct the third ear experiment, or the death month experiment. Bryan would explain the project as follows. The third ear experiment, produced by Brant Withers, was an attempt to connect my eustachian tubes to my pineal gland by physically rerouting the way in which sound entered my body. I blocked up my external ears and attached a copper funnel to my mouth and set out to see and hear what would happen. The experiment was extremely torturous and meditative. Each day gave birth to a multitude of new ideas of which I was unable to document thoroughly. The act of documentation itself was often a hindrance to the experiences, so I made quick notes and as many sketches and paintings as possible for future illustration and investigation, and I could easily spend the rest of my life doing so. Bryan would mention, looking back on this experiment, how the loss of hearing was a physical impossibility and that he began hearing through the side of his bones and inside of his mouth. By day 18, he was hallucinating all day long, 24/7, for the next 10 days straight. He also taught himself how to, quote, breathe sound. And so both artists, John Duncan and Zev, made albums especially for him to breathe. They made music for him personally to inhale while he was doing the experiment. Quote, I discovered how to breathe sound today. While sitting in front of Phil's stereo speaker and listening to Panicsville, I discovered how to breathe sound. It's incredible. A feeling like none I've ever known before. And the resonance practically levitates me. I've left a link in the video description to this concept below, should you wish to explore this particular experiment, as well as what he discovered in great detail. If there was one goal that Bryan was still eager to achieve, it was, as he refers, to confront the human condition and become more engaged with his experiences and perceptions. By drawing and writing while experimenting with his behaviours, environments and sensory systems, Bryan aims to simultaneously increase sensitivity while expanding his ideas about art. So for his 2018 drawings experiment, despite it ultimately evolving into more of a life challenge than an art challenge, between the 6th of January and the 4th of February, Bryan would temporarily cut off his sense of sight by blindfolding himself, immersing himself in total darkness for 30 days. Again, this experiment would not be entirely new to Bryan, as per previous drawings he had created whilst blindfolded or simply with his eyes closed, but this would be the first time he would practically live an entire month completely blocking out any visual stimulation. Apart from some, quote, painful occasional moments that light would leak in through the gaps of his blindfold, which after long periods of deprivation would feel to Bryan like being kicked in the face by a horse. Even at times hallucinating ambient light that wasn't there, to stronger visions of figures or psychedelic patterns. His sense of time would be completely accelerated or dramatically decreased, and in turn his sense of touch, hearing and smell would become amplified. After just a few weeks into the experiment, Bryan learned to grunt consistently, effectively allowing Bryan to navigate the world without bumping into anything by the change in acoustics of his grunting in the environment he would be in. As for his drawings, the results would be a collection of fascinating windows into his experience living under such an extreme loss of sense, arguably one of the most important senses to an artist especially. Bryan would detail this period daily in his journal, however this time, he would obviously be unable to write extensively whilst blindfolded, and so instead, he would record audio tapes to both document his experience to aid him with the side effects of occasional loss of time, as well as even his memory, which up until this time heavily relied on Bryan's vision. Over the period, Bryan would produce not just self-portraits, for obvious reasons, but also what he would call illustrations of experiences and observations, life hacks, or things he learned to do to make life simpler for himself during this experiment, and tapping meditation drawing songs, something that Bryan did to, quote, calm my nerves and distract myself from the possibility of succumbing to a crushing feeling of dread and doom. Instead of grouping these bodies of work together in separate chapters, Bryan decided to keep everything, both art and journal entries, together in relation to their time of creation. Though by his admission they were sadly many things that were not captured by the journaling process, but were expressed more thoroughly in descriptions and titles of the images instead. By the end of the experiment, Bryan felt he had truly improved at communicating artistically, and the audio journaling would cease altogether, and was replaced by directly recording and documenting the life experiences as they were happening in the moment, instead of reflecting upon them verbally afterwards. The experience of being totally blind proved to be an extreme challenge, and yet it was one that Bryan would look back on positively, almost not wanting it to end, in part because of having such great friends close by. Not only did they keep in touch with Bryan constantly during the process by way of texts, phones, calls and home visits, but some of them even took him out into the world to experience the experiment outside the walls of his home safely. Within these 30 days of being blind, Bryan did almost every challenge he set out to do and more. Again, I've left a link in the video description where you can purchase Bryan's journals, which by the way, will be able to fund his next experiments. With a continued desire to test his body and his senses to inspire his artwork, in 2019 and 2020, Bryan would this time create a series of drawings and self-portraits influenced by temperature, sometimes subjecting his body to extreme hot or cold conditions, or a combination of both. Bryan approached this experiment with determination and excitement at the beginning, but afterwards would look back on this series of drawings as one of his most difficult cognitive challenges. Bryan would experience shocking physical phenomena throughout the entire process that would leave him at a loss as to what exactly happened to him. For example, when he would immerse himself into a bathtub containing hot water of up to 126 degrees Fahrenheit, his skin would stick to the sides of a bathtub like adhesive tape. After slowly managing to peel himself away, he would try and research online what this could have meant or what health risks it could bring. But his search results would usually come up empty. Even reaching out to doctors for medical advice would be in vain, receiving not one response from any of them. Bryan even began to doubt the very purpose in his experiment. Quote, I felt like the reason for doing these sensory experiments was for gaining self-knowledge, but if I couldn't learn anything from them, then what was the point? On the other hand, I believe that when neurological changes take place, the body will still learn even when the mind cannot. So I kept going forward with the experiments without gleaning much understanding from them. I even ordered several incredibly expensive textbooks and handbooks on thermal regulation and thermoreception, but they were no help to me at all either. These books were mostly filled with pages and pages of mathematical equations. The one really good thing that came out of the frustration of not understanding my physical changes was my note-keeping. Over time, my journaling evolved from vague descriptions of events into more general philosophical or inspirational kind of reasoning, like a collection of statements concerning drawing and the sensory experiments. By the end of the first month, I had become more focused on the bigger questions about art, experience, and drawing. It was as if this activity and its inability to generate meanings forced me to turn inwards to better define why I do these experiments in the first place. That was pretty helpful, even though it wasn't the kind of information I had hoped to acquire. One thing I did learn was that thermoregulation or human temperature control is extremely complex, and perhaps one of the most vital elements of our entire physiology. Thermoregulation and thermoreception are also totally overlooked in the arts, and because of that I'm beginning this issue with a few of my earlier experiences and experiments with drawing and temperature. Each mystery that happened to me greatly increased my curiosity, and now I'm confident that an entire year dedicated to temperature would still not be a sufficient amount of time to explore it." End quote. Unfortunately, I'm again unable to show too many of his drawings and photographs from this experiment due to the platform's terms and conditions on nudity, but I absolutely get immersed into the results that manifested from it. Again, despite it being such an extreme approach to illustrate ideas and concepts, his creativity to describe the sensations of intense temperatures, even color coding the different extremities of pain, display a very fresh perspective on the human experience and its functionality. Please follow the link I've left in the video description should you want to have a deeper dive into his journals and more of his drawings from this period. Like I said earlier, Bryan's Under the Influence self-portraits is how I first became familiar with him and his art. It was not until getting to speak to him personally, learning more about his life and seeing more of his artwork that I realised how much more powerful his expressive nature in his work truly is. What I find most fascinating in Bryan's work is his willingness to let the absolute worst experiences imaginable to turn them into something either relatable, beautiful, or mysterious. As fascinating as his other projects have been, I decided to save this particular concept of his for last, as for me personally, it remains the most inspiring and thought-provoking of his ideas. Bryan's drawings, known as the Composites, are experiments that Bryan practices periodically using art as a tool for analysis. They take several different forms. On a couple occasions he's done them for months at a time. When Bryan began doing daily self-portraits, he would channel an experience or stimulation or a perception or what have you. Once that changed or his attention was drawn elsewhere, Bryan would have to abandon the drawing or make a separate one about the new sensation, perception or stimulation because his nervous system was always fluctuating. The composite drawings are him playing with different ways of combining multiple perceptions or different observational perspectives, experiences, sensations, stimulations, and combining them all into one image, subsequently creating a much wider observation record of his complex personality. And this allows for the communication of a lot more information and expands the potential for drawing tremendously. The reason why I admire his composites so much is because they capture everything and hide nothing. Every single detail that Bryan feels in that moment of drawing is engraved on paper, thus perfectly preserving the most unclouded perception of his character. And because of his incredibly vivid imagination, the way he achieves illustrating such cognitive traits is often through mysterious and beautiful surrealism, something that I'm sure a few long-term subscribers will know I'm a huge fan of. If I was to name one example, it would be his self-portrait sketch depicting him in an oriental theme with wonderful textured shading creating a dramatic storm-like aesthetic. I adore how he illustrates himself in such a way that is really pushing beyond his usual techniques by portraying himself as a Chinese figure in that very similar traditional style. In addition to self-portraits like this, he would also, as you might expect by now, capture his episodes of struggling with mental health and even at times serious medical conditions. When looking at a self-portrait of one of his migraines, or with him with crippling abdominal pain, it makes it such a tangibly powerful viewing experience. Bryan Lewis Saunders to this day is still not only creating at least one self-portrait every day, regardless of any circumstances, but after getting to know his story in much deeper detail, I was absolutely thrilled and amazed at just how much duly owed recognition Bryan is now receiving around the world. Not just due to the internet meltdown over his Under the Influence self-portraits, but he's also exhibited his art alongside artists such as Jean-Michel Basquiat and Damien Hirst, even exhibiting alongside Vincent van Gogh in Haarlem, Netherlands in 2015 called Die Macht der Mens, and please forgive me if I said that wrong. There was also a brilliantly put together independent documentary on Bryan's art called Art of Darkness, which is still available to watch on YouTube and which I've left a link for in the description below should you wish to take a gander. But the reason why I wanted to share Bryan's life and work with you in this video is not for the shock value or to say, hey, look at this weird art, but rather to provide his art with something that I think often remains forgotten nowadays, especially here on the internet, which is context. I was shocked at how Yuko Tachashima's art, for example, or more specifically her work titled I Can't Be Your Wife Anymore, had remained for so long as the face of Reddit posts and creepypastas. Even at times I read comments on Reddit saying, oh, this is clearly made by a serial killer or something. However, after exploring more of her art in detail, actually assessing what it is that she's trying to convey, even realizing now, fairly recently, that most of her drawings are self-portraits, you realize her art may look disturbing without context at first, in a blog post somewhere, but really there is a lot of heartache and sorrow in her work, with disturbing imagery simply being a tool to express the brutality of her experiences. Outsider art, or art that unapologetically strays from a norm, is very easy to misjudge. And of course, like any other style of art, contemporary or otherwise, artwork like Bryan's is not going to please everyone's tastes. And I can't stress this enough, you absolutely must not attempt any of these extreme experiments for yourself, especially if you have zero training in health and safety. But purely as a curious person that I am, I can't help but be drawn to creativity that explores something left ignored, or something that is often less desired in conventional society. In a world that constantly feels like everyone dresses the same, talks the same, listens to the same music, idolizes the same celebrities and everything, it's refreshing to see a crack in the routine every once in a while, allowing you to have a wider perspective on not just the world around you, but within yourself as well. Bryan would actually explain perfectly how he regards himself, his work, and his perspective on art and the world at the end of the Art of Darkness documentary. Quote, I definitely think of myself as weird. Some people may think of me as creepy, but I don't actually think of myself as creepy. I think people might be creeps themselves and see something of creepy nature in them and then be like, oh, that's creepy. I don't set out to be like, oh, I'm going to be as creepy as possible. I've done some bad things in the past, but I use the art really to change my life and become a good person. I need to be more accepting that I'm a good person. When it comes to the dark side in the arts, for tortured soul, it's the tortured people that give a shit. It's the tortured people that care. And art is probably the best tool we have right now to deal with all of it. Some kids get into art because they have nothing else to do, and so at art universities they might say, you don't have to be tortured. You can just like the images and stuff. But I think that there's something very lacking in that. There's not enough people in the Western world really even using their brains anymore. And it gets worse as time goes by. They're doing less thinking, more repeating, more cut and paste. I'm not saying go out there and cause problems for yourself, but I would just say, find out what bothers you or upsets you and explore it. Then ask yourself, why is that? What is it about me that makes me react this way? And then they're going to go there and create some interesting stuff. To briefly conclude this video on that point, and to emphasize again what he and I just said, it's important to not deliberately create problems for yourself or go to the same extreme as maybe Bryan does. But if you're an artist or someone who wants to get started in art, when problems do arise, when insecurities start niggling at you, don't be ashamed or embarrassed of it. Art can be one of the most therapeutic and insightful ways to reflect on what goes on inside our head, which is normally out of our control. And if you're struggling on what to draw next, or if you're new to art and not sure where to start, maybe try doing a self-portrait or two. Or more specifically, try and capture the mood of yourself during that self-portrait, because you'd be amazed at the results you can get from it, in not only exploring your potential as an artist, but exploring your potential as a person who you can see as more valuable, more confident, and more in control of your insecurities and those darker places. Thank you so much for watching this video. I know it was a long one, but I hope it's been of interest, and I hope it's encouraged you to take a deeper look into Bryan's work, which again can all be accessed from the links I've left below, along with his Instagram, and a link to his drawing experiment books, which you can purchase to fund his future projects. Before I shoot off, it's that time again for a feature I always get excited about at the end of my videos called Artist Corner, where I get to share and briefly discuss some artwork from one of my viewers. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce you to the beautiful drawings of Polysman. He is a self-taught artist from Greece who excels in traditional art, entirely composed from graphite and charcoal. He also likes to incorporate surrealism into his work, attempting to capture themes taken from life or dreams. When it comes to the meaning and ideas behind his drawings, however, he very much prefers to leave it open to interpretation. He always finds it more interesting hearing what others think of them and what meaning they can pull out of each one. It is honestly nothing short of inspiring to see this level of skill achieved by someone self-taught. His level of detail is achieved with such meticulous care, with a medium notoriously known for being messy at times. Powder blue is one of my favourites, as I instantly get an immediate familiar sensation when looking at it, reminding me of those moments at times I just get lost inside my own head, as personified by the hedge maze looking structure inside the head. Entwined is also just as mesmerising to look at. I suppose for me personally, it's mostly down to the technique in this one. How Polysman has managed to perfectly execute the texture of the bandages, it just looks so satisfying. I want to thank Polysman for his submission, and I encourage you all to check out his Instagram that you see here and in the description below to have a look at some more of his mysterious drawings. And as always, a huge thank you to my top tier channel members for this month: Blaine B, Christopher Watt, Port Perea, Classy Chassis, Wendy Go, Ken B, Carol Hartung, and Garrett Greathouse. I can't thank you enough for your continued donations and support. And if you'd like a shout out in a future video yourself, or want to see my videos early, please consider becoming a Blind Dweller member today for as little as $2.99 a month. See you all in the next video soon, and bye for now.